Good morning. My name is Arjun Ander.
My name is Richard Tang.
My name is Ivan Gopanico.
My name is Gabriel Nunez, and this is Criminal Justice Discrimination. So our research question was, are implicit biases against African Americans causing inequality in the United States criminal justice system in the last 20 years? Our research showed that yes, it is affecting inequality in the last 20 years in the United States. It's causing it. And our solution is to implement awareness campaigns to highlight this issue further.
African Americans face discrimination in the prison system through three specific ways. First of all is overrepresentation in federal, state, and local prisons. Second of all is racially profiled parole and probation treatments. And third of all is post-prison penalties. In 1970, the U.S. imprisonment rate excluding jails stood at roughly 100 per 100,000 people. 4 decades later, this number had grown nearly 4 times as large, and actually 1 in 81 black adults in the U.S. is serving prison time in state prisons. According to this demographic by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, we can see that black men are incarcerated at 5 to 7 times the rate than that of white men of all ages. Second of all, people of color make up 5% of inmates in Texas public facilities and 69% of inmates in Texas private facilities. According to this demographic by Josh Gregory, we can see that the total inmate population total range for people of color in private facilities ranges from 65 to 89%, while for public being 60 to 75%. This indicates that racial disparities in private prisons housing inmates are significantly greater than in publicly run prisons. Thirdly, the prison pipeline unfairly treats African Americans while serving their sentence. For example, black adults are about 3.5 times as likely as whites to be supervised. And although African Americans make up 13% of the U.S. adult population, they only account for 30% of those on probation or parole. We can see that according to this demographic by the U.S. Census Bureau, we can see that on a national level, blacks are 4 times as likely to be supervised than that of whites. And in New York, we can see that they are almost 7 times as likely to be supervised than that of whites. Finally, prison penalty against African Americans is racially prejudiced even after serving their sentence. In 2010, 8% of all adults in the United States had a felony conviction on their record. Among African American men, this rate was nearly 1 in 3. According to this demographic by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, we can see that black men and women are twice as likely to be affected than that of white men and women. This indicates that African Americans with criminal records face a host of obstacles to re-enter society, even after they have fully completed their term of incarceration or community supervision.
There's also discrimination with law enforcement, and the 3 main ways they are discriminated against African Americans are through racial profiling, suspicion, and arrests. As you can see, this infographic by the Prison Policy Initiative, black people are disproportionately stopped by the police, and white people are more likely to call for help from the police. This creates distrust between the African American community and law enforcement, which leads to further inequality. According to Mark Ramirez, a professor at Arizona State University, quote, a majority of black people view police, 72%, prosecutors, 61%, and judges, 54%, as treating blacks and whites differently. Due to this fact, African Americans don't contact law enforcement in emergencies, which results in further inequality. Due to racial profiling, African Americans are also more prone to suspicion, which leads to arrests. As you can see, according to Mark Ramirez, for example, almost 30% of blacks in the study by Heffley and Hurwitz in 2010 reported some unfair treatment by the police. Due to suspicion, this leads to unfair treatment and a predisposed mindset by law enforcement towards African Americans that they are criminals, which lead to more arrests. As you can see by this infographic by the American Civil Liberties Union, 62% of African Americans are arrested for low-level arrest warrants, and 94% of them are booked. This is a large disproportion, which shows how much the inequality is prevalent, and due to these arrests, they can go end up in prison, as Richard stated earlier.
Black Americans not only face previously stated policing problems, but also discrepancies in representation, particularly as juries, as lawyers, and as judges. According to this demographic by Duke University, in cases where there is no effective black representation on the jury, the conviction rates for blacks were 81% compared to whites at 66%. On the other hand, in cases where there is at least one black juror on the jury, the conviction rates for both black Americans and white Americans were nearly identical. Considering that black Americans constitute 13.6% of all population in the United States, it is statistically less likely for them to be placed on jury duty, and thus it is more likely for there to be no effective black American representation, thus increasing the conviction rate for black Americans. Furthermore, according to this demographic by Bloomberg Law, in 2020, the passing rate for white test takers on their law school bar exams was 88% compared to blacks at 66%. In 2019, the passing rate for whites was 85% compared to blacks at 61%. Considering that, according to the American Bar Association, blacks constitute 5% of all lawyers in the United States, if the passing rate for black Americans in law school bar exams is less than that of white Americans, it is less likely that the black American voice will be heard in courts. Furthermore, according to this demographic by the Equal Justice Initiative, 22 states, currently shown here in red, have all white Supreme Courts. 16 of these states, which is nearly a third of the entire nation, there has never been a black Supreme Court justice before. In cases where Supreme Court justices need to rule on their state constitutions, the black American voice will not be heard. This is a major problem.
The last way that implicit biases cause discrimination is through discrepancies in sentencing. We see this through the discrepancies in jail time received through sentencing, discrepancies in punishment for the cocaine epidemic, and discrepancies in death penalty sentencing. Beginning with discrepancies in jail time sentencing, we can see in this demographic from the Prison Policy Initiative that black people are sentenced to 3 times longer prison time than their white counterparts, even for the same crime. This is coupled with the fact that overall, the odds of receiving a custodial punishment are 30% greater for black people when compared to their white counterparts. These two factors combine together to make it so that black people are more likely to go to prison and go for prison longer when they are sentenced. Second, the cocaine epidemic was specifically used to target minority and black populations. These two policies were created during the cocaine epidemic. The first said that for 500 grams of powdered cocaine, you would get a mandatory sentencing time of 5 years in prison. However, for crack cocaine, you only needed 5 grams for the exact same sentence. While on paper, these laws seem equitable, in practice, powder cocaine was used by white and majority populations, whereas crack cocaine was used by minority and black populations. What this ended up doing is making it so that the government can very easily punish minorities for a very little amount of substance, whereas white people could get away with having a lot more. The last method of discrepancy is through death penalty sentencing. As you can see by this infographic from the Death Penalty Info Center, black people and white people make up a nearly equal percentage of death row inmates. This is despite the fact that, like Richard said, black people are only 13% of the US population. The reason this is happening is because when the jury is informed that death penalty is a possible punishment, they are 25% more likely to find black people guilty than white people. This shows a great injustice in the public perception and how people are more likely to sentence a black person to death than a white person.
To summarize, our research question was whether implicit biases are causing inequality against African Americans in the criminal justice system. And our argument is that indeed there are implicit biases that are causing this discrepancy. Our solution to this problem is to raise awareness regarding this issue through the use of public awareness campaigns and public speeches. There's also a way to implement policies that specifically target these biases.
But obviously, the solution does have limitations. Any solution that's trying to create awareness and inform the public can't happen overnight. So these solutions will mean that this implicit bias could stay around for decades or even centuries. However, this is still a guaranteed path to re-educating the public and creating awareness.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Perfect, stay right there. We'll start with Richard and work our way across. Richard, if you had a 5th person in your team, what's something that they could have, a perspective they could have brought to this that would have been useful in the process?
Well, if we if we had a fifth person on our team, we could probably add the perspective of police brutality, which has been highly prevalent in recent years, especially with the incident with Norfolk.
All right, thank you. Arjun, describe an argument from one of your peers' research that makes you think differently about your solution.
One of the arguments from my friend Ivan's research was that he talked about how the crack cocaine epidemic saw that governments were specifically targeting black minorities in contrast to white majorities. This very opened up our research about how these implicit biases are really targeting black Americans in the criminal justice system.
All right, and Ivan, if there was there any research that any of you collected that you didn't use, and then why didn't you use it?
Yeah, absolutely. If we go back to the cocaine epidemic, my original solution that I made in my argument was that we could have government oversight where we force every Supreme Court to look at every new law before it's passed to avoid things like the cocaine epidemic, right? With these discrepancies in laws. But like Arjun said, the Supreme Courts are very biased and black people aren't represented on them. So if we do just say that every white Supreme Court has to overlook the white focused laws, obviously it's not going to create change.
Okay. And I'll save the best for last, Gabe. Reflecting on everyone else's work, which one had the biggest impact on you?
The biggest impact that it had on me was Richard's research, because my research is the start of the problem, law enforcement, and his is all the way at the end when they get to prison. And we cover that whole divide by Ivan and Arjun.